In the 3rd year of our marriage, my CEO wife secretly flew overseas to see her late first, love's younger brother. Someone snapped intimate photos of them, and they went viral. She rushed back in a panic, and the moment she landed, she saw countless missed calls and messages. She opened the last voice message. Sis, Grandpa Mu passed away. Call me back as soon as you hear this. Liu Ruoyan's face darkened as she called her younger sister back. What exactly happened? After a few seconds of silence, her sister realized she hadn't heard the whole message, so she repeated it. Your husband came to the hospital to see Grandpa Mu today. Grandpa saw the photos of you overseas with Mr. Ito, got so worked up that he suffered a brain hemorrhage, and passed away shortly after. They tried to save him. Your husband took it really hard. Liu Ruoyan went pale, breathing fast. She gripped her phone and asked, where is he? I don't know. The Mu family cremated and buried Grandpa Mu this afternoon. No one knows where your husband is now. All I know is that after he left the hospital, he made one request. Ruoyan instantly guessed what I had asked for, and her jaw tightened. I won't divorce him. Her sister continued. Grandma and Auntie already agreed to his request. Liu Ruoyan's expression darkened, and she kicked the suitcase beside her across the floor. I never said I wanted a divorce. But sis, you really went too far this time. Liu Ruoyan looked terrifyingly furious, and cursed under her breath. Her assistant, Song Yaoji, trembled beside her. It was the first time she'd ever seen Liu Ruoyan lose control like this. Miss Liu. Liu Ruoyan rubbed her brow, and called me with a pale face. The call went through, but no one answered, so she called her mother instead. The moment the call connected, neither mother nor daughter said a word. Liu Ruoyan's throat felt dry, but she still lowered her voice and asked, Mom, where's Mu? Are you with him? Mrs. Liu finally spoke, her voice flat and cold now. Before Liu Ruoyan could say anything else, her father, Liu Cheng, snatched the phone and started yelling at her. What did I do to deserve a daughter like you? Get home right now. Liu Ruoyan listened without expression, but her heart kept growing colder. Where is Mu right now? He's your husband and you're asking me. Are you even human? I'm warning you. Get back here now, and tell that man named Ito that the Liu family's door will never open for a homeworker like him, unless we're all dead. A dull pain spread through Liu Ruoyan's chest. She wanted to explain, even though she'd always hated explaining herself. Dad, he and I aren't like that. Liu Cheng sneered. It doesn't matter anymore. Mu only has one request now. Divorce. If you have any conscience left, let him go. The moment Liu Ruoyan heard the word divorce, her whole back stiffened and her fists clenched. I won't divorce him. You think you can just refuse? Who do you think you are? The angrier Liu Cheng got, the more he yelled. Liu Ruoyan hung up, and her heart sank even deeper. She opened her mouth to say something, but in the end she had nothing to say. Miss Liu, we need to find Mr. Mu first. Liu Ruoyan slowly raised her eyes, her face livid. Back to the villa. On the way back, Liu Ruoyan kept calling me, but no matter how many times she tried, I never picked up. She leaned against the seat, gripping her phone. Drive faster. Yes, Miss Liu. Miss Liu, we're here. Liu Ruoyan pushed the door open and got out, with Song Yaoji right behind her. Song Yaoji stared blankly at Liu Ruoyan's hurried, desperate figure. When Mrs. Wang saw her, she froze for a moment. Miss, you're back. Liu Ruoyan frowned deeply, her eyes fixed on the 2nd floor. Is Mu home? No. Seeing how bad she looked, Mrs. Wang couldn't help asking, did something happen? Liu Ruoyan ignored her, strode upstairs, and pushed open the bedroom door. Everything was still there, including my laptop and personal belongings, but she still felt uneasy. All my things were there, but I wasn't, and she had no idea where I was. She needed to see me right now. Liu Ruoyan turned around with a grim expression and headed downstairs. Mrs. Wang had just hung up the phone. She looked at the two women in shock. Liu Ruoyan stopped and stared at her darkly. Who was that? Mrs. Wang clearly hadn't fully processed it yet. It was Mr. Mu. He said I could go back to my hometown, and that he would never come back again. He said I could get rid of everything in his room. Liu Ruoyan's face darkened. What else did he say? Mrs. Wang shook her head blankly. Nothing else, miss. What happened? Everything was fine this morning. Liu Ruoyan closed her eyes, found my sister Mu Yongxuan's number, and called her. Just when Liu Ruoyan thought no one would answer, Mu Yongxuan's cold voice came through. Miss Liu. Liu Ruoyan spoke in a low voice, unusually yielding. Where's Mu? I want to see him. The moment Mu Yongxuan heard Liu Ruoyan's voice, her expression turned cold. The divorce papers are at the Liu house. Please sign them when you have time. Please let my brother go. Let him have a life. With that, Mu Yongxuan hung up. Liu Ruoyan rushed downstairs and headed straight for the door. Back to the family estate. The Liu estate was brightly lit, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Everyone in the Liu family had changed into solemn black clothes to mourn Grandpa Mu. The moment Liu Ruoyan stepped inside, Her pupils tightened, and she dropped to her knees before the old madam. Her voice came out hoarse. Grandma, where is Mu? I need to see him. Old Madam Liu kept her eyes closed, slowly turning the prayer beads in her hand, then ignored Liu Ruoyan. Liu Ruoyan lowered her head, her expression stiff. Where is he? Mu asked for nothing, but we set up a trust in his name, and your grandmother transferred her shares to him. If you have no objection, sign the papers. Liu Ruoyan froze. She looked at the divorce agreement her mother handed over and took it with trembling hands. She flipped to the last page. My signature was really there. She gripped the papers tightly. So none of you are going to tell me where he is. Her father, Liu Cheng, looked at her coldly and stepped closer. Do you really think he wants to see you? Mu is my husband. I'll find him. Even if I have to turn this entire city upside down, I'll find him. Then she turned a chilling gaze toward Song Yaoji. Call Director Wang. Tell him to find Mu before sunrise. Liu Cheng's face turned livid. He stepped forward, grabbed her collar, and shouted, Now you remember he's your husband. Where were you when he needed you? Liu Ruoyan swallowed hard, her voice hoarse. I can explain everything to him. Liu Cheng cut her off. Answer me. Did you keep the promise you made to Mu? Did you lie to him? Liu Ruoyan couldn't answer. She hadn't kept her promise, and she really had lied to Mu. I just didn't want him to overthink it. Makoto Ito and I aren't together. I'll explain everything clearly to Mu. Mrs. Liu stepped forward and silently looked at her. After a long moment, she sighed. Liu Ruoyan's pupils tightened. She looked at her mother and softened her voice. Mom, please tell me where he is. I need to see him. Please let me see him. Mrs. Liu shook her head. It's not that I won't let you see him. Your father and I don't know where he is either. Liu Cheng sneered. Do you know why they buried him without even holding a wake? Because Mu no longer wanted to appear as your husband, and he didn't want you at the funeral. Liu Ruoyan, you don't deserve to be his wife. Liu Ruoyan stood there helplessly, as if she couldn't understand what those words meant. Old Madam Liu slowly opened her eyes, and the warmth was gone from her face. If you still consider me your grandmother, sign the divorce papers. Stop looking for him and stop disturbing his life. Liu Ruoyan's heart went cold for the first time. She knew what it felt like to be completely powerless. She lowered her head and turned to leave. Watching her walk away, old Madam Liu shouted sternly, If you keep looking for him, then from this day on, you are no longer part of the Liu family. Liu Ruoyan clenched her fists, and finally let out what sounded like a bitter laugh. Instead of leaving, she turned around and dropped to her knees again. Grandma, I'm sorry, I can't do that. If I can't find Mu, then I'll kneel here until your heart softens and you tell me where he is. Liu Ruoyan had probably realized the old madam had hidden me somewhere. Old Madam Liu glanced at her granddaughter, then stood up and left. Mrs. Liu helped her away, while Liu Cheng snorted and returned to his room. In the huge villa, all the servants had already withdrawn, leaving only Liu Ruoyan on her knees, and Song Yaoji beside her. Song Yaoji gritted her teeth and knelt down too. Miss Liu. Liu Ruoyan lowered her eyes, her expression hidden in the dim light. Miss Liu, should I secretly send people to look for Mr. Mo? Liu Ruoyan slowly raised her eyes, and gave a faint, bitter smile. If Grandma arranged the place herself, no one will find it. Song Yaoji was left speechless. So you're really just going to keep kneeling here? Grandpa's face appeared in Liu Ruoyan's mind. She clenched her fists and laughed bitterly. I deserve to kneel. Song Yaoji gritted her teeth. Then I'll stay here with you. Liu Ruoyan slowly closed her eyes, her hoarse voice filled with exhaustion and helplessness. No, you have something else to do. Tell me what you need, Miss Liu. Liu Ruoyan slowly opened her eyes, a sharp glint flashing through them. Find out what really happened with those photos. Song Yaoji hurriedly stood up. Yes, Miss Liu. I'll get to the bottom of it right away. Liu Ruoyan said nothing. She knelt upright in the hall, her mind filled with images of me. At the hospital, I felt like I'd had a very long dream. I dreamed my parents and grandpa were still alive, and our whole family was happily traveling together. Then the scene suddenly changed. I saw my parents covered in blood, and grandpa lying in the funeral hall. I jolted awake from the nightmare. My friend Chu Chen heard me, and rushed into the room. Mu, are you okay? Did you have a nightmare? Just then the door was suddenly pushed open. Mr. Chu, is Mr. Mu awake? I looked at the familiar face. Auntie Wang, why are you here? She looked at me with a complicated, pained expression. The old madam called me, and asked me to come back and take care of you. From now on, I'm here for you, so don't worry. I couldn't reject Grandma's kindness. I tried to smile, but I just couldn't. Okay, Auntie Wang, I understand. Thank you for taking care of me. Then I took the soup Auntie Wang had brought. 10 minutes later, phone on the nightstand and picked it up. It was filled with missed calls from Ruoyan. I deleted and blocked every way she had to contact me. I want to tell you what I was actually thinking, lying in that hospital bed, because I think it matters, for everything that happened afterward, that you understand I wasn't grieving a marriage in that moment. I was grieving my grandfather, the one person who had raised me after my parents died in an accident when I was 9. The one person whose approval I had spent my entire adult life quietly trying to earn. He was the one who had insisted, 3 years earlier, that I marry into the Liu family despite my own reservations, convinced that Liu Ruoyan's steady, practical nature would be good for me. He had liked her, genuinely, in the early years, before either of us understood exactly how much of that steadiness was performance rather than character. He had died believing his grandson's marriage had been destroyed by a wife too selfish to keep a single promise, and no divorce settlement, however generous, was ever going to give me back the chance to tell him he'd been right to worry, or to comfort him, in whatever his last conscious moments had actually held. Auntie Wang, in one of the few unguarded moments she allowed herself during those first weeks, told me what she'd heard from the nurse who'd been present that day, filling in a scene one hadn't been in the room for but have replayed more times than I'd like to admit since. My grandfather had been scrolling through his tablet the way he did most afternoons, mostly reading business news out of habit rather than any real need, when a family friend's message alerted him to the photos already spreading across social media. Ruoyan, laughing, her hand resting on Makoto's arm in a way that left very little room for innocent interpretation, captioned by whichever gossip account had picked it up first with breathless speculation about the Liu CEO's secret overseas romance. The nurse said he went very quiet, set the tablet down carefully, the way he did most things, and asked only one question before his breathing changed. Does my grandson know yet? Nobody in the room had an answer for him. He was gone within the hour, and I have never been able to decide whether it comforts me or breaks me further that his very last coherent thought was apparently about protecting me from something I hadn't even learned yet myself. Chu Chen and I had known each other since our first week of university, paired as roommates by an administrative accident that turned into the closest friendship either of us had ever managed to build. He'd been overseas himself, finishing a security consulting contract in Singapore, when Auntie Wang's call reached him, and he told me later that he'd booked the first available flight, without even asking what had happened, simply because Auntie Wang's voice had carried a specific, controlled panic he'd only heard from her twice before in 15 years of knowing the family. He canceled 2 weeks of client meetings without explanation, a decision that cost his firm a contract he never once mentioned regretting, and arrived at the hospital roughly 14 hours after the call, still in the same clothes he'd been wearing when he boarded the flight. Chu Chen, who had been my closest friend since university and had flown back the moment Auntie Wang called him, sat with me for most of that first week, saying very little, mostly just present in the particular, steady way that good friends manage without needing to fill every silence with something useful to say. It was Chu Chen who finally asked, on the 4th day, whether I actually wanted to know the truth about the photos, or whether I'd rather just let the divorce finalize and move forward without ever learning exactly how bad it had actually been. I told him I needed to know, not because it would change anything about the divorce. My mind on that had been made up the moment I'd seen my grandfather's face go slack in that hospital bed, but because I couldn't build whatever came next on top of a version of events I only half understood. Chu Chen had connections I didn't, mostly through his work at a private security consultancy that handled corporate due diligence for clients considerably more paranoid than the average CEO. He brought in an investigator named Fang Wei, methodical and entirely unbothered by the size of the family, whose secrets he was about to start pulling apart, and within 3 weeks, Fang Wei had assembled a timeline of Ruoyan's relationship with Makoto Ito, considerably more damning than a single overseas trip, and a handful of photographs. Makoto Ito was, as Ruoyan had always described him, the younger brother of her first love, a young man named Kenji Ito, who had died in a climbing accident nearly 8 years earlier, before Ruoyan and I had ever met. I had known, marrying her, that she still sent money occasionally to Kenji's family, still visited when Makoto came through the country for business, and I had never once thought to question it, because grief for a dead first love seemed, on its face, like exactly the kind of loyalty a decent person maintained. What Fang Wei uncovered was considerably less innocent. Ruoyan and Makoto had been quietly involved, on and off, for nearly 2 years, meeting during his business trips under the cover story of honoring his brother's memory, exchanging messages Fang Wei recovered from a secondary phone Ruoyan kept registered under a shell account tied to one of Liu Corporation's subsidiary companies. The overseas trip that triggered my grandfather's collapse hadn't been a hospital visit for a man on a hunger strike. The story Ruoyan had told her own family. It had been a planned week together at a private resort, photographed by a paparazzi stringer who'd recognized Ruoyan from a business magazine cover, and had no idea, at the time, exactly how much damage those photos were about to cause. Fang Wei's first briefing with me happened in Chu Chen's apartment rather than any office. Over a kitchen table covered in printouts I initially struggled to make sense of. He was a compact, unhurried man in his 50s who spoke, I noticed, the way people do when they've learned that most clients want the truth delivered slowly enough to actually absorb it. Mr. Mu, he said, before showing me a single document, I want to tell you now that whatever we find, you don't have to act on any of it. Some clients want ammunition. Some just want to finally understand what happened to them. Which one are you? I told him, honestly, that I didn't know yet, and that I'd decide once I actually understood what there was to know. He nodded, satisfied with that answer in a way that told me he'd heard worse ones, and spent the next 2 hours walking me through exactly how he intended to build the timeline, financial records, travel logs. A discreet conversation with a hotel concierge in Osaka, who'd apparently grown fond enough of Ruoyan's tips over 2 years to remember her visits in considerable detail. Before I left that first meeting, Fang Wei asked me one more question that I've thought about often since, more than any piece of documentation he ever eventually produced. Mr. Mu, whatever we find, are you prepared for the possibility that it implicates people you still love, not just people you're angry at? I told him I didn't fully understand the question yet. He said, simply, that in 14 years of this work, the cases that damaged people most weren't the ones where the villain turned out to be a stranger. They were the ones where the investigation reached further than anyone expected, into people the client had never once considered suspecting. I didn't know, walking out of that apartment, exactly how much that warning would end up mattering. I only knew, months later, that he'd been right to ask it. I hadn't known, before my grandfather's will was read, exactly how much he'd actually built during the decades everyone in the Liu family had quietly assumed he was simply a wealthy, retired benefactor content to let his grandson marry into someone else's more prominent name. Grandpa Mu had spent 30 years, patiently and almost entirely out of the public eye, building a controlling stake in 3 separate logistics and manufacturing firms that fed directly into Liu Corporation's own supply chain, not through anything resembling hostility, but simply because he'd trusted, early on, that a quiet, diversified foundation mattered more than a flashy public portfolio. Old Madame Liu had known. It was, I understood later, part of why she'd approved the marriage in the first place, and part of why, once she learned what her granddaughter had actually done, she moved so swiftly, and so completely to protect me rather than her own blood. The trust my grandfather had set up in his final months, once his health began failing and he'd started quietly, suspecting something was wrong in my marriage even before any of us had proof, consolidated all of it, the logistics stakes, a considerable private investment portfolio, and, after his death, old Madame Liu's own personal shares in Liu Corporation itself, transferred to me, not as a gift exactly, but as what she called, in the brief, formal letter that accompanied the paperwork, a correction. Your grandfather built quietly because he trusted quiet things to last. I am doing the same, so that whatever my granddaughter threw away, you do not leave this family with nothing to show for the years you gave us. I read that letter 3 times before I fully understood what she'd actually handed me, not just financial security, but a considerable, direct stake in the very company Ruoyan had spent her entire adult life building her identity around running. The trust's lawyer, a careful, precise man named Counselor Xu, who had apparently managed my grandfather's quiet affairs for nearly 2 decades without a single leak or indiscretion, sat with me for an entire afternoon, walking through the full scope of what I'd actually inherited. Watching my expression carefully as each new figure landed, he told me, near the end of that meeting, something I've thought about often since. Your grandfather asked me once, years ago, why I never recommended he consolidate everything under a more public, aggressive structure the way most men his age eventually did. I told him quiet capital survives longer than loud capital, because nobody circles something they don't know is there to be taken. I think, Counselor Xu said, closing the final folder, he built this entire structure specifically so that if anyone in your life ever underestimated you, you'd have something considerably more substantial than pride to fall back on. I didn't fully understand what he meant by that until months later, watching Ruoyan's own board turn against her, with documentation her family had quietly helped me assemble. My grandfather, it turned out, had been protecting me from exactly this kind of moment for years before either of us ever knew it would actually arrive. I didn't plan, in those first weeks, to use any of it against her. I genuinely didn't want revenge in the way the word usually gets used. I wanted distance, and quiet, and enough time to grieve my grandfather without a single camera or missed call reminding me, every hour, of exactly how badly the last 3 years of my life had actually gone. It was Fang Wei's investigation, and what it eventually uncovered about Makoto Ita's own role in all of it, that changed my mind about staying quiet entirely. Ruin kept kneeling in that hall for 4 full days, according to what Auntie Wang told me later, refusing food beyond what Song Yeoji occasionally managed to convince her to accept, refusing to leave even to sleep in her own bed. Mrs. Liu brought her tea twice a day and said very little. Liu Cheng stopped acknowledging her presence entirely by the 2nd day, stepping around her in the hallway the way you'd step around an inconvenient piece of furniture. Old Madame Liu never once came back down to see her. On the 5th morning, Ruin finally collapsed, not from the kneeling itself, but from a stress-related collapse her own doctor later attributed to a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and what he delicately termed acute emotional distress. She woke in a hospital bed 2 hours later, Song Yeoji asleep in the chair beside her, and the first thing she did, before even asking for water, was reach for her phone to check whether I'd called. I hadn't. I had blocked every number she had access to weeks earlier, and I felt, reading the report of that morning much later, no particular guilt about it at all. Song Yeoji, during those same 4 days, was quietly running down the assignment Ruin had given her that first night. Find out what really happened with those photos. What she found, working mostly through contacts in the entertainment press, who owed her favors from years of careful relationship management on Ruin's behalf, was that the paparazzi stringer who'd sold the photos hadn't stumbled onto the story by luck at all. He'd been tipped off 3 days before the resort trip by an anonymous source who provided the exact hotel, the exact dates, and a description specific enough that he'd known precisely where to position himself before Ruin and Makoto had even checked in. Song Yeoji brought that detail to Ruin the moment she woke in the hospital bed, expecting it might offer some sliver of comfort, proof, at least, that the leak had been deliberate rather than simple bad luck. Ruin didn't react the way Song Yeoji expected. She asked, instead, in a voice gone suddenly quiet, whether the tip had come from inside Makoto's own circle, someone who might have wanted the affair exposed for reasons that had nothing to do with punishing her. Song Yeoji didn't have an answer for that yet. Neither did I, when I eventually learned about the tip myself, though I've come to suspect, without ever fully proving it, that Makoto's own increasingly desperate business partners in Osaka may have had considerably more motive to force his hand toward ending things quietly than anyone initially considered. What Fang Wei found about Makoto Ito, over the following month, was considerably worse than a man simply taking advantage of a grieving woman's guilt over her dead brother's memory. Makoto ran a mid-sized import business in Osaka that had been, according to financial records Fang Wei obtained through channels I decided not to ask too many questions about, quietly hemorrhaging money for nearly 3 years, propped up almost entirely by a series of personal loans and investments that traced back, once you followed the paper trail far enough, directly to ruin. She hadn't just been unfaithful. She had been funding a failing business under the guise of honoring a dead man's memory, siphoning funds through Liu Corporation's charitable foundation, in amounts small enough, individually, to avoid triggering any internal audit, but substantial enough, cumulatively, that Fang Wei estimated the total diverted over 2 years at a figure that would constitute serious fraud against her own company's shareholders, the moment anyone with proper authority actually looked closely at it. Makoto, for his part, had known exactly what he was doing. Messages Fang Wei recovered showed him referring to Ruin, in private conversations with a business partner in Osaka, as his safety net, and joked, more than once, about how convenient it was that grief made people so much easier to keep generous. I don't think Ruin ever saw those messages. I don't think, even now, she fully understands how much of what she believed was a genuine, complicated love affair was, from Makoto's side of it, simply an efficient way to keep his failing business alive on someone else's money while she quietly ruined her own marriage and reputation to protect a secret he'd never once actually valued as highly as she had. I brought everything to old Madame Liu directly, once Fang Wei's findings were complete, partly out of respect for what she'd already done to protect me, and partly because I understood, by then, that the fraud against Liu Corporation's charitable foundation was no longer simply a private matter between Ruin and me. It was a corporate governance issue with real legal exposure for the company itself, and old Madame Liu, whatever grace she might have extended her granddaughter in private, had spent 60 years building Liu Corporation into something she wasn't willing to let anyone's personal failures quietly compromise from the inside. She read through the full report in near total silence, the same prayer beads from that first night, in the hall moving slowly through her fingers the entire time. When she finally looked up, her expression had none of the cold, Formality I'd grown used to over 3 years of family dinners. It had something closer to genuine grief. I chose her for you, because I believe she had steadiness in her, she said quietly. I was wrong about a great many things, it seems. What do you want to do with this, Moo? I told her the truth. I didn't want to hide it, and I didn't want to protect Ruoyan from consequences she'd spent 2 years building for herself. But I also didn't want to be the one who delivered them personally, not out of mercy, exactly, but because I understood that whatever came next needed to be about Liu Corporation's own integrity, not about a jilted husband settling a private score. Old Madame Liu nodded slowly, the way she did when a decision had already fully formed in her mind. Then it won't be you who delivers it, she said. It will be the board, and the truth, and whatever is left of her own conscience, once she finally understands what she actually threw away. The emergency board meeting was called for the following week, ostensibly to address the leadership transition questions that had already begun circulating since Ruoyan's public absence following her grandfather's death, and the viral scandal surrounding the photos. Old Madame Liu, who still held enough influence over the board despite having formally stepped back from daily operations years earlier, made sure the meeting's actual agenda wasn't shared with Ruoyan until she was already seated at the table, flanked by board members she'd always considered reliable allies. I attended as a shareholder, my grandfather's trust having made that a formality nobody on the board could reasonably object to, sitting near the back of the room rather than at the table itself. I want to be honest that I didn't enjoy watching what happened next, not in the vindicated, satisfying way I might have expected to a few months earlier. Old Madame Liu opened the meeting herself, laying out Fang Wei's findings in the same flat, methodical tone she'd used reading the report in her study, ending with a specific figure, the total amount diverted from the charitable foundation over 2 years, projected forward against the foundation's annual audit cycle, representing exactly the kind of governance failure that would have triggered a regulatory investigation regardless of whether anyone in the room chose to pursue it internally first. Ruoyan's face, I was told by 2 separate board members afterward, went through nearly the same sequence of emotions I remembered from the night of my grandfather's death: confusion, then denial, then a dawning, horrified understanding that this wasn't a private family matter anyone was going to let her manage quietly. She tried, briefly, to argue that the transfers had been legitimate charitable support for a grieving family, a claim that collapsed within minutes once the board's own general counsel walked through the specific mechanism Fang Wei had documented, payments structured deliberately to stay under audit thresholds, routed through accounts with no actual connection to Kenji Ito's surviving family at all. She turned, at one point, directly toward where I sat near the back of the room, and asked, her voice cracking in a way I hadn't expected to still affect me, whether I had orchestrated all of it out of spite. I didn't answer her in that room. I let the general counsel's own methodical walkthrough of the evidence answer for me, because I understood, by then, that anything I said personally would only give her a way to reframe the entire investigation as a jilted husband's vendetta, rather than what it actually was, a company discovering, on its own timeline and through its own governance processes, that its CEO had been defrauding it. One board member, a stern woman named Director Peng who'd worked alongside Ruoyan for nearly 6 years, asked only one question before the vote was called. Was there ever a single foundation disbursement in 2 years that actually reached the family it claimed to support? The general counsel checked his notes and confirmed there hadn't been. Director Peng didn't ask anything further after that. The vote to remove her as CEO, pending a full independent audit and potential referral to regulators, passed with only the 2 board members she'd arrived with abstaining. Nobody voted to defend her outright. I learned later that several board members, who had privately admired her leadership for years, simply couldn't find a version of events. Once the full documentation was laid out, that let them separate her competence from what she'd actually done with the company's own charitable trust to fund it. The story reached the financial press within 72 hours. The same news cycle that had briefly treated Ruoyan as a sympathetic figure, the CEO wife, whose overseas trip had, according to the earliest, vaguer reports, tragically coincided with her own grandfather-in-law's fatal collapse, reversing itself entirely once the board's findings became public. The narrative that had briefly painted her as a woman unfairly hounded over a private grief now recast her, accurately, as an executive who had defrauded her own company's charitable foundation to fund a secret lover's failing business while her husband's dying grandfather watched the fallout from a hospital bed. Liu Corporation's stock dropped considerably in the 2 sessions following the announcement, recovering only once the board named an interim CEO and issued a statement emphasizing the company's swift, decisive internal response. Ruoyan's own social circle, considerably faster to abandon her than even her own family had been, evaporated within the same week. A charity gala she'd co-chaired for 3 consecutive years quietly removed her name from its planning committee. 2 magazine profiles scheduled to run that quarter, celebrating her as one of the country's most influential young executives, were pulled entirely. Song Yeoji, the one person who had knelt beside her in that hall and stayed loyal through every humiliating week that followed, finally submitted her resignation once the regulatory referral became public, not out of disloyalty exactly, but because staying employed by a woman under active financial fraud investigation had become, professionally, untenable for anyone hoping to work in the industry again. Song Yeoji's resignation, I learned much later from Feng Wei, who had grown almost fond of the loyal assistant, over the months of monitoring the situation, didn't happen over email or through any formal channel. She drove to the small rental apartment Ruoyan had moved into after the villa was sold, sat with her for an entire afternoon, and told her, through tears she apparently couldn't fully hold back despite her own professional training and composure, that she couldn't keep working for her. Not because she'd stopped caring, but because every week she stayed made it harder for her own career to survive the association. I still think you're a good person, underneath all of this, Song Yeoji reportedly told her, gathering her things. I just don't think being a good person, underneath something is enough anymore. Not when the something on top of it cost this many people this much. Ruoyan didn't argue. She simply nodded, and thanked her, and told her she deserved considerably better than 2 years of loyalty to someone who'd repaid it this poorly. I watched all of this unfold from a careful, deliberate distance, mostly through updates from Chu Chen and occasional, brief calls with old Madame Liu, who seemed to age visibly over those weeks in a way that had nothing to do with grief for her late husband, and everything to do with watching a granddaughter she'd raised turn out to be someone she genuinely didn't recognize. I want to be honest that I felt, watching it all happen, considerably less triumphant than I'd expected to. Mostly I felt tired, and mostly I felt a specific, quiet grief for the version of Ruoyan I had married 3 years earlier, the one who had, in the very early days of our marriage, seemed genuinely capable of the steadiness my grandfather had believed in. I learned what happened between Ruoyan and Makoto in the weeks following the board's decision secondhand, from Feng Wei, who had continued monitoring the situation at old Madame Lia's request, even after his original assignment technically ended, mostly to make sure Ruoyan's desperation didn't curdle into something that put the family at further legal risk. Ruoyan called Makoto the same night the regulatory referral became public, according to phone records Feng Wei was able to access, and the call lasted 11 minutes. She flew to Osaka 4 days later, against her lawyer's explicit advice not to leave the country while an active investigation was underway, apparently convinced that Makoto, whatever else had happened, would at least offer her the comfort nobody in her own family was willing to provide anymore. The 11-minute call itself, according to a partial transcript Feng Wei was eventually able to reconstruct from records obtained during the later criminal proceedings, began, almost unbearably, with Ruoyan apologizing to Makoto for the trouble the leaked photos had caused his own reputation, as though the collapse of her entire career were a secondary concern next to his comfort. He'd been cold even then, she would later admit under questioning, offering only clipped, distracted responses while she poured out 2 years of accumulated devotion into a phone he was apparently only half listening to. She told herself, boarding the flight to Osaka 4 days later, that seeing him in person would restore whatever warmth the phone call had lacked. It was, Feng Wei told me later, the last genuinely hopeful decision Ruoyan made in the entire unraveling of her life. What she found, according to the account Feng Wei eventually pieced together from a hotel employee willing to talk once the story had already become impossible to keep quiet, was Makoto considerably more interested in distancing himself from the fraud investigation than in comforting the woman who'd funded his failing business for 2 years. He told her, plainly, in a conversation that grew loud enough for staff in the adjoining suite to overhear parts of it, that he couldn't be seen associating with her while regulators were circling, that his own business couldn't survive the reputational damage of being publicly linked to a fraud case, and that whatever they'd had, it needed to end quietly, immediately, and without any further contact between them. Ruoyan, by every account of that evening, finally understood, standing in a hotel room in the same city, where she'd once flown to comfort a man on a supposed hunger strike, exactly what she had actually built her entire betrayal around, not love, not grief for a dead man's memory, but a convenient, patient exploitation she'd been too invested in her own version of the story to ever clearly see. Something in her broke, considerably more completely than anything the board vote or the press coverage had managed. The hotel employee described hearing glass break, followed by Ruoyan's voice, raised in a way considerably beyond simple argument, accusing Makoto of using his brother's memory as bait for 2 years, of taking money meant for a foundation that helped actual grieving families while performing grief himself for her benefit. What happened next moved past an argument into something the hotel's own security footage eventually confirmed: Ruoyan striking Makoto across the face hard enough to draw blood from a cut near his eyebrow, and when he grabbed her wrist to stop a second blow, shoving him backward into a glass table that shattered under his weight, cutting his forearm badly enough that hotel staff called for medical assistance before security even arrived. Makoto required 11 stitches. He filed a police report the following morning, once his own lawyers advised him that any lingering sympathy for Ruoyan's public downfall would evaporate entirely the moment assault charges became part of the story alongside everything else. Makoto's own business, already hemorrhaging money before any of this began, didn't survive the publicity either. Once the assault case made local Osaka news, connecting his name publicly to the fraud investigation back home, 2 of his remaining major suppliers quietly terminated their contracts. Unwilling to be associated with a business owner, now tied to an international scandal involving corporate fraud and a violent altercation in a hotel suite, he filed for bankruptcy protection within the year. The safety net Ruoyan had unknowingly funded for 2 years finally, completely gone, along with the reputation he'd apparently believed would survive discarding her. I felt, hearing that particular detail from Fang Wei, something I hadn't expected to feel about a man who'd caused so much damage to my own life. Not quite satisfaction, but a certain grim acknowledgement that the story had at least found its way to something resembling proportion. The assault charges, filed in a jurisdiction with no personal history of favoring Ruoyan the way her own home city's business community once had, moved through the courts considerably faster than the ongoing fraud investigation back home. She pled guilty, eventually, on the advice of a lawyer who recognized, correctly, that a trial would only extend the media coverage she'd been desperately hoping might finally start to fade. The sentence itself was modest by the standards of the fraud case, still working through regulators back home: a fine, a period of probation, a formal restraining order preventing any contact with Makoto Ito for a period of 5 years. But the story of it, once it reached the financial press back home, closed off any remaining possibility that Ruoyan might eventually be permitted a quiet, private return to some smaller version of her old life. A CEO who defrauded her own company's charity was one story. A CEO who defrauded her company's charity to fund a lover who then discarded her, provoking an assault serious enough to require police involvement in a foreign country, was a considerably harder story for anyone to eventually forgive or forget. The regulatory investigation into the foundation fraud concluded 4 months later, resulting in a formal finding of financial misconduct, a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any publicly registered company within the country, and a restitution order requiring Ruoyan to personally repay the full amount diverted from the foundation, a sum that, combined with the legal fees from both proceedings, consumed nearly all of her personal savings, and forced the sale of the apartment she'd purchased years earlier. With her first significant bonus as CEO, Fang Wei attended the restitution hearing himself, mostly out of professional habit rather than any obligation to report back to me, and told me afterward that Ruoyan had shown up alone, no lawyer beside her beyond the one required to file the paperwork, no family present in the gallery, wearing a plain gray coat considerably less polished than anything he remembered seeing her in during the 2 years he'd spent investigating her life. She answered the judge's procedural questions quietly, without argument, and signed the restitution agreement without asking her lawyer to negotiate a single term, as though she'd stopped believing, somewhere over those months, that she still had any standing to ask for better terms from anyone. Fang Wei said the detail that stayed with him longest wasn't anything she said. It was that she left the courthouse on foot, declining the car service her lawyer had arranged, walking alone into a crowd of pedestrians who had no idea they were passing a woman who'd once run a company worth more than most of their combined lifetimes of earnings. Liu Cheng, for his part, never softened at all, not once, in any conversation I had with the family over the following years. He told me directly, the last time our paths crossed at a business function neither of us had realized the other would attend, that he considered Ruoyan's downfall a matter of simple consequence rather than tragedy, and that he'd raised her to understand exactly where lines were supposed to sit, and she'd crossed every one of them anyway. I don't waste grief on choices, Moo, he said, in the same flat, clipped tone I remembered from that night in the hall. I only have grief left for your grandfather, who deserved considerably better than what our family gave him in the end. Old Madame Liu, by contrast, told me once, in one of our last real conversations, before her own health began declining the following year. That she thought about Ruoyan constantly, in the particular, exhausting way grandmothers think about grandchildren who have disappointed them without ever quite stopping being loved. I failed to teach her that a full life requires choosing, honestly, between the things you actually want, she said, turning her prayer beads slowly the way she always did when working through something difficult. She tried to have everything, all at once, and never learned that the trying itself was the theft. Not from you, not even from Liu Corporation, in the end. From herself, mostly. Though I doubt she'll ever see it that clearly. Her health began declining in earnest about a year after that conversation. A slow accumulation of small complications her own doctors described, carefully, as simply the ordinary weight of 83 years finally catching up to a woman who had spent most of her life refusing to slow down for anything. I visited every few weeks, more often than I technically needed to given how little remained tying me formally to the Liu family beyond the trust itself, mostly because I'd come to understand that old Madame Liu had become, somewhere, in that first terrible year, something closer to family in her own right rather than simply my former grandmother-in-law. She asked about my son constantly, memorized small details about his growth from the photos Lin Wei sent, and told me, on one of the last visits before her health made conversation genuinely difficult, that watching him grow up loved by people who actually chose each other had done more to ease her own conscience about Ruoyan than any apology ever could have. Old Madame Liu did not attend the restitution hearing. Neither did Liu Cheng or Mrs. Liu, though Mrs. Liu told me, the one time we spoke that autumn, that she still sent Ruoyan a small amount of money each month, quietly, without her husband's knowledge, not because she believed her daughter deserved forgiveness, but because she couldn't quite bring herself to let her only child go entirely hungry, whatever else had happened. I didn't ask whether Ruoyan knew where the money actually came from. Some kindnesses, I've learned, are more meaningful when they're never fully explained. I want to tell you what my own life actually looked like during those same months, because I think it matters that this story doesn't end with me sitting quietly in the wings watching someone else's consequences unfold. The apartment near the harbor was small, deliberately so. A single bedroom with a view of the working docks rather than anything resembling the villa's manicured garden. And I remember the first night I spent there feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at all in the middle of grieving my grandfather and dismantling a marriage simultaneously. Something close to relief. I unpacked exactly one suitcase. Auntie Wang, who insisted on visiting weekly whether or not I actually needed anything, told me on one of those early visits that she'd never seen me look less burdened, even surrounded by grief, than I did standing in that half-furnished apartment choosing, for the first time in years, exactly where every single object in my life would go without needing to consider whether it matched anyone else's expectations of what a Liu family son-in-law's home was supposed to look like. I moved out of the villa entirely, into a smaller apartment near the harbor that had nothing to do with either the Liu or Mu family names attached to it, and spent most of that first year doing something I'd never actually done in 3 years of marriage, building something that was genuinely mine. I used a portion of my grandfather's trust to formalize what had, until then, been a loose collection of quiet minority stakes into an actual holding company, bringing in Chu Chen as a partner and Fang Wei, once his investigative work wound down, as head of our own internal risk division. A decision that felt, in hindsight, like the most fitting possible use of everything his work had taught me about how quietly damage can accumulate when nobody's paying close enough attention. I named the holding company Kessler and Mu, despite having no actual person named Kessler involved anywhere in its formation, a small, private joke only Chu Chen ever fully understood, referencing a name from a story he'd once told me about quiet inheritances mattering more than loud ones, back during one of those long, mostly silent evenings in the hospital when neither of us particularly wanted to talk about anything real. It felt right, building something with a name that belonged to nobody's expectations but my own, after 3 years of a marriage where everything, including my own last name on the villa's deed, had somehow still managed to feel like it belonged more to the Liu family than to me. I met Lin Wei, the woman who eventually became my second wife, almost a year to the day after my grandfather's funeral, at a supplier conference neither of us had particularly wanted to attend. She ran a boutique architecture firm specializing in sustainable warehouse design, entirely unconnected to either the Liu or Mu family's business interests, and the first thing she ever said to me, after I awkwardly introduced myself using only my first name, was that she didn't care much for small talk, and would rather discuss whether I actually understood the environmental impact assessments my own company was required to file. I found myself, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, genuinely looking forward to a conversation. We didn't move quickly, which I think was exactly what both of us needed after the versions of love we'd each survived before meeting each other. She'd mentioned, early on, a long relationship that had ended, when her own ex-partner grew resentful of how much time her firm's early growth required of her, and I recognized, in her careful, deliberate pace, the same instinct toward caution I'd been nursing myself. We dated for a year before either of us used the word serious out loud, and even then, it was Lin Wei who said it first, over a work dinner that had nothing romantic about its original purpose, telling me, plainly, that she'd stopped pretending our meetings were only about supply chain logistics months earlier and assumed I had too. I just hadn't trusted myself yet to say so first. We married 2 years later, in a small ceremony at the same Harbor View apartment building, where I'd rebuilt my life alone. Just the rooftop garden and 40 guests, who actually mattered rather than the 300 my first wedding to ruin had required for appearances. Chu Chen stood as my best man, predictably, and gave a toast that somehow managed to be both genuinely moving and thoroughly embarrassing in the exact proportions only a 15-year friendship earns the right to. Old Madame Liu attended and cried through nearly the entire way, calling me afterward her actual grandson in a way she'd never quite managed to say during 3 years of my marriage to her biological granddaughter. Lin Wei was the first person I told about the message that same evening, mostly because we'd built our entire relationship on a foundation of not keeping things from each other, a deliberate contrast to everything my first marriage had taught me not to repeat. She read it over my shoulder twice before saying anything, then asked, carefully, whether I wanted her opinion, or just needed to think out loud. I told her I wanted both. She said only that she trusted me to know the difference between mercy and reopening a wound that had finally, mostly, healed, and that whatever I decided, she wasn't going to spend the evening pretending she had a strong opinion about a woman she'd never met and hoped never needed to. It was, I think, exactly the right amount of support to offer, and exactly the reason I never once doubted, deciding how to respond, that I was building something considerably steadier the second time around. Ruoyan reached out to me, exactly once, nearly 2 years after everything had settled into, whatever quieter, permanently diminished shape her life had finally taken. The message arrived through Mrs. Liu, who I still spoke with occasionally, carefully worded, asking only whether I might be willing to meet, just once, so she could apologize properly rather than through lawyers and board statements. I thought about it for exactly 1 evening before deciding my answer. I wrote back, through Mrs. Liu, that I appreciated the impulse, and that I genuinely hoped Ruoyan found whatever peace she needed to build a smaller, more honest life going forward. But I told her, plainly, that I had already said everything I needed to say to her, the day I asked for a divorce without ever picking up her calls, and that some apologies matter more to the person offering them than to the person meant to receive them. I never heard from her again after that, and I've come to understand that some silences are their own kind of closure, considerably more honest than any conversation either of us could have actually managed. Lin Wei and I had our first child 2 years into the marriage, a boy we named after my grandfather, a decision old Madame Liu wept over so thoroughly the first time she held him that Lin Wei had to gently take him back before her tears actually reached his blanket. Old Madame Liu visits often, still, despite her own health making the trip harder each year, and has taken to telling my son, entirely unprompted, long, meandering stories about a great-grandfather who built quiet things that lasted, stories I suspect are only half accurate but that I've never once corrected, because I think some inheritances matter more as stories than as strict fact, and because watching her find, in my son, a small piece of the family she still recognized as worth being proud of felt like its own kind of quiet repair, neither of us had expected to get to witness. Chu Chen still teases me, occasionally, about the name Kessler and Mu, insisting I owe him a proper explanation someday for the joke he half remembers making up in the first place. I've told him, every time he asks, that some stories are better left slightly unfinished, the way my grandfather apparently preferred his own quiet fortune to stay unfinished in the public record, for 30 years before anyone thought to ask what it actually added up to. My son is only 3, too young yet to understand any version of this story beyond the simplified one old Madame Liu tells him, but I've already decided, quietly, that when he's old enough to ask real questions, I'll tell him the truth in full, not to burden him with it, but because I think he deserves to understand exactly why his father believes so firmly that quiet, honest things last longer than loud, convenient ones, and exactly what it cost to learn that lesson the hard way, before he ever had to learn it himself. Fang Wei still consults for Kessler and Mu on retainer, these days mostly training our own junior risk analysts, rather than running investigations himself, though he told me, at a company dinner last spring, that he still thinks about the Liu case, more than any other in his career, not because of its scale, but because it was the rare case where the client walked away from it building something, instead of simply walking away wounded. Most people I work for just want the truth so they can stop hurting, he said. You wanted it so you could start building something honest instead. That's rarer than you'd think. Auntie Wong retired 2 years ago, finally, after nearly 4 decades in service to families who rarely thanked her properly for the quiet, constant care she provided. I made sure her retirement was considerably more comfortable than the Liu family's pension arrangements would have otherwise allowed. A small correction I felt was long overdue for a woman who'd sat with me through the worst week of my life without ever once asking for anything beyond the chance to help. She visits my son too, now, on alternating weekends when her own grandchildren aren't in town, and calls him, without any prompting from me, the sweetest boy I've ever raised a soup for. A comparison that makes Lin Wei laugh every single time she hears it repeated at family dinners. I don't know if Ruoyan ever thinks about any of us this way, the small, ordinary Sunday dinners, the soup, the grandchildren who get to grow up knowing exactly who loves them and why. I hope, somewhere in whatever quieter life she's building now, she's found something resembling it, even in miniature. Not because she's earned my hope for her, just because I've learned, these past years, that carrying hatred for someone who's already lost everything costs more than it's worth, and I'd rather spend that particular currency on the people who actually deserve it. Mrs. Liu still calls me twice a year, on my son's birthday and around the anniversary of my grandfather's passing. Brief, careful conversations that never mention Ruoyan directly unless I ask, and I've mostly stopped asking, not out of anger anymore, but because I've learned there's nothing left in that particular chapter that either of us needs to keep revisiting out loud. She did mention, the last time we spoke, that Ruoyan had finally taken a small administrative job at a logistics firm 2 cities over, unconnected to anyone who'd recognize the Liu name, working under a slightly altered version of her own name to avoid the recognition that still occasionally found her online. I didn't ask for details beyond that, and Mrs. Liu didn't offer them, and I think we both understood, without needing to say it directly, that this was as much closure as either of us actually required. Not forgiveness, not further punishment, just the plain, quiet fact of a life continuing somewhere far smaller than the one she'd once been so certain she deserved. I think about my grandfather often, still, mostly with gratitude rather than grief these days. He built quietly because he trusted quiet things to last, old Madame Liu had written in the letter that first told me what he'd actually left behind. I understand that sentence considerably better now than I did reading it in a hospital room, still half convinced my entire life had just been permanently ruined. It hadn't been ruined. It had simply been cleared, painfully and all at once, of everything that had never actually belonged to me in the first place, leaving room, finally, for a life I got to build on my own terms, with people who valued me for considerably more than the name I happened to carry into a room.